So, welcome to today's MentorCore event. I am Lisa Beth Lentini Walker, and I'm one of the co founders of MentorCore, along with.
Hi, I'm Dan Ayala, the other co-founder of MentorCore, because you can't have one co without another co, right?
That's right. And our community is about providing a welcoming and safe space for compliance, security, and risk professionals to grow and develop on their own terms. We help provide mentoring relationships and other opportunities for people to learn and develop. And today I am thrilled because we have my friend, Jan Randolph Friese, and we are going to be talking about making the decision about law school in a pandemic. And we'll be answering your questions as we go along. But a lot of the concepts hold true, pandemic or not. Pandemic, I think, just is the great revealer. So anything that's out there is maybe bigger, more evident. Gaps are more easily seen, and people are feeling a lot more pressure and stress. So
Totally
let's
agree.
talk about all of this and tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa Beth. I am really excited to be here with you guys. I am a second career lawyer. I was a nonprofit executive before. I have now been in private practice at a large firm in Minnesota, as well as in-house counsel, as associate general counsel. My specialty is securities and corporate governance. But right now, I have found yet another chapter, and I am teaching at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, which I really enjoy and is an opportunity to try to mentor the next generation of lawyers. So I'm excited to be here. I also have a side hustle where I talk to people about uh, what it takes to succeed in law school and help them think through that choice. It's called JD Navigator. And so that is part of the basis for what I'm talking to you guys about today.
That's
Great. Well, welcome.
fantastic. Yeah. So, JD Navigator, tell us a little bit more about how JD Navigator works, what types of things you're hearing as questions that people have. Like once
Mhm.
somebody says, what about law school? What's the next question?
Right, right. Well, the core of JD Navigator came out of this idea that a lot of people don't actually have a good understanding of what lawyers actually do. They have watched too much Law and Order, and they have no good understanding of what the actual process of going to law school, getting through law school, and then getting a JD job would mean for them in their lives. And that's a problem, especially to the extent that people are paying, really serious money, and 3, frankly, pretty painful years to get somewhere that they don't want to be. So my goal is to try to help people have a better sense of the frankly many different valuable career opportunities that a JD does open up, as well as what it doesn't really open up for people, so that they can make an informed decision.
Any
That's
career where I don't get bong bong in the background, it's not one I want to go into.
Yeah, and fortunately, it is rare actually to have that happen as a real lawyer. So
But what you'd be very surprised if it did. Sounds like a great prank.
so, as a lawyer myself, and full disclosure, I actually teach as well and work with Jen. Um, I know a lot of people that I went to law school with did the 3 years, took the bar exam, practiced for maybe a year, and then
oh,
they were like, no, you know what? My heart's really in teaching, or my heart's really in anything but this.
mhm.
And so I always found that really interesting because you've invested so much time and energy into it. What would you say is a good way to kind of try it before you buy it? Like,
Mhm.
I know some of the people in my class tried out being like a paralegal for a year. What are the different paths you can take?
Yes. So that's definitely one thing that people do is they work as a paralegal or a legal assistant or whatever. That's going to give you a lot of good insight about the kind of office that you are doing that in. But you'll have a better idea, for instance, do you want to be a trust and estates lawyer when you are a trust and estates paralegal? Okay. I think one of the things that you need to do is try to get a broader understanding of the rest of the legal market, so you can think about where you might find a fit. So,
Hmm.
for instance, fully half of lawyers are transactional lawyers. Back to the Law and Order example. Okay, transactional lawyers, we never go to court. All right, we're doing paperwork in the background. We're helping write wills or contracts, maybe negotiating a merger, something like that. And so if you are a person who likes paperwork, likes to design systems that work, likes to get things right the first time, you might be a transactional lawyer. Okay. If that sounds terrible to you, you should not be a transactional lawyer. Okay. Possibly you would like being a litigator, maybe a prosecutor, or on the other side, a criminal defense attorney, right? Where you're you're working for either the government or for someone who has been accused of serious crimes by the government. Um, but those are all different things that we can do with that same JD degree. Sorry, that doesn't answer your question very specifically, but you want to get a broader sense of what people actually do as attorneys. So I am trying to do a little bit of that as JD Navigator, writing articles. I have an online course, etc. But certainly, there's also lots of other good information out there that help you understand kind of the day-to-day life of real attorneys.
But at the risk of I guess at the risk of bringing together the liberal arts metaphor into into this very specific world, what can a JD do? I mean, does a JD have to end in a in a law career? I guess purposefully end in a law career. We see people with bachelor's and master's and other things, and even PhDs and other things, use them as enablers, as door openers, as learning how to learn, learning how to research, learning how to do enough things to enable them to get careers that may not require it or may just bolster upon it. Do you see people doing that path as well? Is a JD a path that enables those kinds of things, or not so much?
So that's a really good point. There are certainly people who go to law school just because law school is a bucket list item for them, or is an addition to, to a way of thinking or so forth. I think the point that more people, especially who are like younger and thinking about the shape of their career, need to understand is, if you want to be a lawyer, you have to have a JD.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a JD, you don't have to be a lawyer. Okay. So then you have to decide, is it worth it to get a JD or not? Right. Certainly, you guys are talking to compliance professionals. There are lots of highly skilled, highly paid compliance professionals who are not JDs. That is an industry that is, I think, is split. And there are places maybe where you're applying for a compliance job where having a JD might be an advantage, but might not be necessary, or it just might not be necessary at all. So
Yeah, and I think just in general, at least from a compliance perspective, there's a pretty big split about whether compliance reports into legal or whether it reports into something else. In a lot of financial services, it is specifically split apart from legal. And I think some of it hinges on kind of what's the industry standard and what are the expectations of the regulators, et cetera.
mm-hmm.
So I know that when I decided to go to law school, I thought I was going to be something very different than what I turned out to be. I thought I was going to be a maritime lawyer and that I was going to do cool things on boats and live on the high seas or something like that, which did not.
That part is still available. Could be part
It could happen. It's getting more and more remote by the minute. But you
Cruise
know,
ships just right for lawyers.
I could ride forever and I'd be the only passenger. So I might be captaining the ship at this point. But yeah, one of the things that I found was I personally believe that if you're interested in the law and you want to be a lawyer, there's a part of the law that is right for you, much the same way I feel about compliance, information security, risk, etc. There is a role for you somewhere if you like the basic skills behind it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I ended up being a securities lawyer too, because that's kind of what I knew and where I felt comfortable and where I did okay.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, and like you, Lisa Beth, many people do go to law school thinking possibly they want to be one kind of lawyer, and then come out in a slightly different direction. That's a very common path. And I think again that exposes sort of how little information most people have about being a lawyer or the different kinds of ways to be a lawyer when they make the decision to go to law school.
So it's not necessary to know the kind of things you know to walk in. You know, as Lisa Beth said, I walked in thinking A. What if I walk in and don't think A or don't think anything and just go, I think I like the law. You know, walking in with a more open, open mind isn't the right word, but a less clear cut definition of what they want to walk out with.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of people that go to law school straight uh, are more in that camp. I agree, Daniel. Yeah. So I work in a program where I have sort of the flip side problem, where I have a lot of second career people. And so I have a lot of people who have a very specific idea of what kind of law they want to practice and how a JD would help them take that to the next level. And so they are going to law school, part time. Our program actually has the ability so people don't have to move to go to law school. They can do it, sort of mostly remote. Um, or they go to law school in the evenings or whatever, in order to add that JD to what they have to offer in their career.
That's great. Yeah, that's a very interesting. We were talking a little bit before. It's a very interesting, next step, especially when you look at where things like, come from the security and the privacy side. You look at where privacy roles in organizations are coming. The JD seems to be, for better or worse, seems to be almost permanently riveted to the job descriptions,
Mm.
or increasingly so.
Mhm.
Whether or not they are part of legal or not, it seems to be somebody found a template somewhere, and that's what they're all going for chief privacy officers. So the question is the juice worth the squeeze in that? But yeah, people in the security and privacy side are increasingly finding their way toward
Mhm.
toward that later in their careers as they go, well, this next step would require this.
Right.
Well, and it's really interesting too, because especially in the privacy realm, if you're talking about multinationals, you may be a qualified lawyer in the United States, but you're not a
Mhm.
qualified lawyer, generally speaking, in the
Right.
European Union. You'd have to go through a whole nother process,
Right.
Mm.
I mean, I'm
right?
10 years into my privacy life,
Hmm.
and 98% of what I've learned has not learned and do has nothing to do with the US.
Wow.
It's primarily outside the US.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about what are some of the differences between students that opt to just go right away into law school versus ones who may decide to do this as either a second career, or they might just decide either they're going to have a couple of years of gap experience or whatever. What are the kind of flavors that you see amongst law students?
Yeah, it's fun to teach law students with those very different backgrounds and goals. Fun kind of in the sense of challenging underneath it, I suppose. Um, I think one of the things that's hard for people that go straight to law school is basically everybody who gets admitted to law school has done well in their past educational experience. And yet that first semester in law school is graded on a curve, and
Hmm.
some of the class is going to get B's and some of the class is going to get C's. And that is a painful moment for people who have never gotten one before. There are a lot of smart people um, in that law school room. Um, and similarly, I think law school is a lot more work than undergrad. There are a lot of people who were able to get through undergrad, um, you know, pulling overnights occasionally as needed, or studying just right before the test, and that was enough because they're very bright and they retain information well. And so law school might be the point where they run into a lack of kind of executive capacity and need to figure out additional ways to organize themselves and their time better. So we definitely see that in first year of law school. That's one reason that first year of law school is hard.
Hmm.
Um, to your point, it is very different as a second career student because you have probably run into both of those walls already in the work world. You have probably not been the smartest person in the room. You have probably failed at something. And you have probably had to, you know, set up better systems for yourself and working, not just pulling all-nighters, etc. And so that is actually a reason that I love teaching second career students, is because they are more realistic about what they can do in law school and what they want to get from law school, and they find it actually less challenging because they've had that life experience. They also bring a life experience to the classroom about how law interacts with real life. And so when we talk about people who, you know, have had a real injustice done in a case that we are reading, um, or you know, some other, like even just buying and selling a house or those kind of life experiences, um, help people understand what we're talking about in the law and the cases uh, in a better way. So I love teaching second career law students. As an individual choosing law school, I don't know if that means that I would counsel you to go straight or not, but it makes for an interesting dynamic.
So let me ask you, we've chatted about this a little bit before. As part of law school, the first couple of years, you've got some mandatory requirements pretty much everywhere you go, because part of this is the expectation that you likely will try to take the bar exam in
Mhm.
some jurisdiction, and there are certain things that everybody just needs to know to pass it.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah. So just for folks who maybe don't know a lot about law school, just to back up a step. So in the US, in general, law school is 3 years. We call those years 1L, 2L, 3L, okay, as opposed to the undergrad things. In addition, law school is flanked by two big tests. Okay, so you take the LSAT, the law school entrance exam, um, in order to hopefully get a good enough score that you can get into law school or maybe even get scholarships. And then after law school, you have to pass what's called the bar exam in order to practice as a lawyer. So yes, as Lisa Beth says, the bar exam is supposed to be a test of sort of general minimal competence in many different areas of the law. And so in order to prepare students to pass the bar exam, law schools require them to take, you know, introductions to many different areas of law, most of which they won't end up using after the bar. It's a very weird system, and there's certainly lots of, I think, very valid criticisms out there of the bar exam as it currently exists, especially in the pandemic, but not even just limited to the pandemic. But for right now, that is the system that we are stuck in. So, as a second career person going back to law school, for instance, Daniel, if you went back to law school to add a JD to your already impressive resume, you would have to take criminal procedure and
Mhm.
civil procedure and criminal law and constitutional law and all of these things that you maybe don't care about and are going to be able to forget once you get through the bar exam, but are just part of that process.
It's a 3-year boot camp.
A little bit, yeah.
Kind of, right?
So,
And then I know that a number of different states not only have kind of some of the basics like contracts, criminal law, etc. Some have like up to 32 different topics that they can test on, including things like wills and estates and tax. And I mean, I took the New York bar exam and it had, I think, 26 or 27 topics, many of which I hadn't seen in law school and will never ever use. But you still had to be prepared for them, and some of the stuff you learned in law school just wasn't in the same topic area because law schools provide a basic education, but they're not preparing you for the bar exam fully. That's why you take a course afterwards.
so
That's exactly right. Yeah. So what Lisa Beth is alluding to is it is considered sort of normal that you do the 3 years of law school, right? You graduate in May, and then you spend all summer doing a prep course for the bar exam in the state in which you're going to take the bar. The bar is administered state by state. Um, and so then you pay that company a great deal of money to teach you all of the things theoretically that you need to know in order to sit for that bar, which usually happens like at the end of August. So it is a very no, sorry, I mean the beginning of August. I misspoke. Okay, so it's a very painful and expensive process. And New York and California are considered the hardest bars. California's is 3 long days, and has a pass rate that is well below other states. It's a challenging test that is designed not to let everyone into the profession.
So, since we're talking about tests and assessments are on everyone's mind as we go into pandemic, two questions about the test. One on either end. One, the LSAT. Are there anything people need to keep in mind about LSAT's testing in pandemic? Have they made changes to how the tests are administered? Are they even still being administered? Anything people need to account for in that? And then the second question is around the bar is, I'm an efficiency guy. Can I skip the law school and go straight to the bar with appropriate studying,
Oh,
or the 3 years of law school required in order to be allowed to take the bar?
Yes, both great questions. All right, let's see. So the LSAT, first of all, so in a pandemic, the LSAT, the company, or sorry, the organization that administers LSAT, which is called LSAC, has moved to what they call the LSAT Flex, which is a remote test that they only offer, at certain times, but you at least don't have to come and be in a room with lots of other people breathing hard together. So,
Because everyone
that's
just
not an
breathes easy.
understatement.
You breathe easy during your tests. I know.
well, you just breathe
Right.
alone, and so that's good.
You breathe.
Yes. Also, for folks who aren't familiar with the LSAT, differently than some other kinds of graduate school entrance exams, does not require you to have any knowledge about the law in this case, or really anything in particular. Okay, the LSAT instead is a comprehension kind of test. It has you read passages and pull out information about them, as well as do kind of logic games kind of things. Okay. And so you can prepare for the LSAT by mostly getting used to those kind of activities, practicing how to do logic games quickly. But you do not have to, do any kind of like pre-law school kind of thing. You also do not have to have a pre-law undergrad in order to know anything that you need to know to do well on the LSAT. Okay, so that's something that people maybe don't necessarily
That's
know.
great. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's wonderful.
Yes. And the thing that is hard about the LSAT, I think, and Malcolm Gladwell did an interesting podcast about this a couple of months ago, is that it requires you to move very quickly, to do to think accurately and extremely quickly. And it's a very interesting podcast episode because Malcolm Gladwell, who of course is very intelligent, but perhaps a little bit long-winded, takes the LSAT, and so does his like 20 some assistant, who is much more used to US standardized testing. And she does better than him, in part because this is just a game about testing well. Okay, so query whether, as Malcolm Gladwell says, that's who we want to be lawyers, is people who test really well. But that seems to be who we are letting be lawyers, is people who test really well. Okay, so I digress. Back to your question about the bar exam. So unfortunately, for you and others, you do have to graduate from an ABA accredited law school in order to sit for the bar exam in almost every state. California does offer a few other options, including thanks for dropping the Malcolm Gladwell in the chat. It's a very interesting podcast. As someone who talks about the LSAT fairly often, I found it fascinating. And also people keep mentioning it to me, like, oh, I know something about the LSAT, Malcolm Gladwell. So there we go. Okay, so in general, no, you cannot take the bar exam without getting a JD. California establishes a couple of other paths, but in return, they have an especially hard bar exam. That's kind of how they're trying to balance those equities. And of course, you would have to practice in California. So, Dan, you'll have to weigh that risk benefit as well. But no, unfortunately, you cannot just sit for the bar exam. Famously, there's a character in Catch Me If You Can. He studies
Yeah.
he studies for the bar and
Right.
passes it. It passes the Louisiana bar, which is also an especially hard bar, because Louisiana has a different state code. It's based more on civil code, like the French, as opposed to common law, like the English, which is what the rest of the U.S. legal system is more based on. But he's a fraudster. He got to be a pilot too, so
Yeah.
it's not available to the rest of us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Frank Abagnale's got a great story.
Yeah.
Great for
Indeed.
compliance people.
And true. I mean, that is a whole a whole lot of things.
Right. So, we've talked a little bit about the LSAT. I know that there's companies that help you prep for the LSAT if you're really interested in it. We've talked a little bit about the different paths in terms of what people can expect in terms of how they interact with classmates. How has that changed in pandemic times? I know some law schools are establishing bubbles and they're testing everybody constantly, and other law schools have a lot more virtual offerings. What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I think like the rest of higher ed, we're seeing a lot of different experiments, and we will sort of see, we are learning, I guess, what's working and what's not working. I'm very happy to teach at a school that has chosen to be just entirely remote, both this fall semester that we're in now, and we've already announced that we're going to be remote in the spring. And I think that works well for our students. They have the certainty to know, as well as for us as teachers, because we can prepare you know, um, classes that are designed to be taught in a distance format, as opposed to have to scramble and switch mid semester. Um, so, law school, unlike say medical school, all we do is trade words with one another, right? We both orally and written. There's no need for us to breathe the same air.
No
So I actually
cadavers.
really uh, I really like teaching and learning online. But as you alluded to, I think one of the things that is lost is the sense of community as among the students, right? That's always been one of the good things about law school, is forming those tight bonds with your classmates. And so I think schools are working hard to try to help people create those relationships, those back channels outside of just the classroom experience, um, to help people feel like they're part of a community of learners.
Well, as a learning style that's so heavily dependent or so deeply steeped in things like Socratic method,
Mm.
it feels like this type of interaction doesn't lend itself as well to that. Have professors been able to make that leap?
Yeah, so if people don't know what Daniel means by Socratic method, if you think back to, say, Legally Blonde, there's a great scene in Legally Blonde where the professor, who is, very scary, calls on a student to recite the facts of the case, and then stays with that student, and they go back and forth, talking in depth about the case that the student read, and what they think about it. That is the Socratic method, and it is sort of been a classic form of teaching in law school, I think since the 1920s. Uh, it's especially prevalent in the first year. I think as you get more into upper level classes, some teachers use it more, others will use a more like problem-based style, which is what I prefer. We work through a lot of application kind of exercises in my class, as opposed to discussing, cases strongly. Okay, so how does that translate in this new technological reality? I have heard professors say that they make Socratic method work. That's not a problem. I can grill you through Zoom.
So the person's like, oh, camera's not working anymore. Oh, lost the
Yeah,
connection.
it's a
Bye.
lot easier to walk out.
Oh, well, not if you want your grade to,
True.
Yeah.
yeah. You always had the option to walk out. But
Oh,
that was never a
much
good idea.
harder when the door was in front of everybody else, because the way a lot of law schools are set up, the professor's right by the door, and they've got like a stadium seating, and it's like, well, you'd have to basically kind of like Animal House type march it out of there.
Oh, well, so I'm going to disagree. I don't think that the thing keeping people in receiving the Socratic style was just that they were unable to bolt out of the door. It's not like the professors
Of
are the rock,
course.
right? There's, you can get by them. Uh
But people who were
Instead it was
afraid of
like,
Socratic method, this is not an escape for this is not the pandemic is not an escape hatch. You
no.
have avoiding it. Okay.
Well, no, but I do think, and I actually wrote a formal academic article about this a couple of months ago. I do think that we were seeing law schools even pre-pandemic, um, trying a lot of different styles, trying more problem-based learning, um, more group-based learning, more projects kind of thing, exploring different kinds of ways to prepare people for practice. Because indeed, what you do as a student in the Socratic method really has very little to do with being a lawyer, unless you are a lawyer that is trying to make an oral argument before a court. Okay, which is a way of being a lawyer, but is a small fraction of the total types of lawyers. Like I said, I'm a transactional lawyer. I never go to court. Okay, that was just purely a fictional kind of approach for me. So law schools were experimenting with different things. Another thing they were experimenting with, even before the pandemic, is that classically law school grades have been based 100% on your performance in the final exam, which is another reason that law school is super stressful, right? Because you have no idea if you were on track and if you were learning the right things. And then you have 3 hours to throw everything you know into a blue book and leave and cry outside the door.
And
Okay.
most people don't, I think most people might not know what a blue book is.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Also,
Okay.
like you're kind of hoping that you feel good because if you get the flu, you are
Mhm.
sunk,
So
right?
it comes down to one day, one grade. Um, and that is still somewhat true, I think, in some law schools and in some classes, but it is becoming much more common to have a midterm or a project or even a series of formative assessments that help people test their learning um, and improve their learning before they're going into that final exam.
Yeah.
We're the science of teaching and learning really shows us that that kind of formative assessment is a much better way to guide people to long-term understanding. And so that's what my article was about, was how we can use those kind of insights into teaching and learning well and do that online.
Very, very interesting. So, I have another question for you. Is it ever too late to get a law degree?
So my oldest student so far has been 78.
Excellent.
Um, And Daniel, as one of your questions earlier alluded to, law school was kind of a bucket list item for him. He was an individual who had owned a company and was now a wealthy retired gentleman, and enrolled in law school. And he was so fun to have in my business law class because, as someone who has bought and sold companies and so forth, he had some real world experience that was very valuable to the rest of the class. But he also told me that he had learned why he had done some things for years that he had just done, thinking that that's how it was done. Now he understood why. And
Mm,
that was very fulfilling to me as a teacher, to help him kind of add some of those I don't know, buttressing understandings, I guess. Um, and yeah, 78.
wow.
Mhm.
So you can go to law school anytime. One of the things we talked about a little bit is kind of, is the juice worth the squeeze, right?
Mhm.
Is it worth investing in law school? We know it takes 3 years more or less. Maybe it takes a little longer if you do one of the programs where you are learning on nights or weekends.
Mhm.
Um,
Usually those are 4 years.
those are 4 years. Okay.
Mhm.
So tell me, do you know generally what it costs to get a law degree right now? I'm sure there's a spectrum.
There is a spectrum, and part of it is the fact that, like undergraduate education, I mean, you can look at the sticker price, but people don't usually pay sticker price, especially if, for instance, you do well on the LSAT and then you don't go to the best school you get into, you go to a somewhat lower ranked school, which is what I did. I went to a regional school that offered me a great scholarship to decrease the amount of debt that I got out of law school with. And that can be a very good strategy. It can be especially a good strategy if if your heart is set on working in a job where you're not actually going to earn a lot of money out of law school.
Mhm.
Because one of the things that I want to make sure that people understand is that a lot of lawyers do not earn the big bucks. Okay. And some of the lawyers that don't earn the big bucks are the ones who are um, really doing the good work of like working for civil rights, working for the environment, working for the poor. Those are poorly paid jobs, and there are not a lot of them. And so, unfortunately, people go to law school with this idea that they're going to help people, but to the extent that they graduate with a ton of debt, they can't afford to take one of those jobs.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was a bit eye-opening for people that I knew is that, you know, you may have your mind set on a particular job. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I have talked to who say, I want to be a women's rights lawyer, or I want to be, you know, working on constitutional law issues. And it's like, good luck. And I thought I was going, like, when I went down and I thought I was going to be in maritime law, I wanted the stuff that I liked was constitutional law issues. And you have to be like really, really seasoned. You're never going to get one of those issues, and they rarely come up. They're
Mhm.
in case law, but there's really not a lot of them.
Yeah.
And so I needed to look at what the real practice was.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I had taken my first class or two that I was like, oh, no, this is not what I thought it was. And then I quickly shifted, right?
Right. And by that time, you were already tens of thousands of dollars in the hole.
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
yeah, and
yes.
you committed.
There's no money back guarantee, right?
No,
No.
not even the very best law schools will give you that. Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's eye-opening on many levels, and a lot of times, I think people go in wanting to make a difference. And you know, I hear a lot of people saying, "I want to be an environmental lawyer," or "I want to be in child protection."
Mhm.
And some of those, there may be a lot of positions, but you may not be able to pay off your debt.
That's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
other ones, there's not very many positions.
Okay.
Does it
Right.
matter what school you go to? This is like the unspoken question that that many are afraid to ask. Does this, you mentioned you went to a regional school. Does it matter what school you go to?
So let's see. How much time do we have left? No, okay, so let's see a little bit of terminology. So the best whatever top law schools in the country are generally called the T14. Okay, so if you see people talk about having gone to a T14 law school,
I've never
and
heard that term.
oh really? Yeah.
No,
Okay.
Well, then clear.
Um,
If you don't know the term,
tell
then
me
you
what
didn't
I'm
go to one.
missing.
yeah. It's a way for people to quickly throw their status around.
Gotcha.
That's
Um,
probably why I've never heard of
It's
it.
like, it's like if you don't know if somebody went to a T14 school, just wait, they'll tell you.
yeah, I'm guessing
Okay.
you didn't go to one, Lisa Beth.
Possible. I'm looking up T14 right
Yeah,
now.
right. So law schools are ranked by the U.S. News and World Report. So that's where the T14 comes from. It's
Okay.
the top 14 schools. But there are more than 250 law schools in the United States. I and the schools at the very bottom are not accredited by the American Bar Association for various reasons. So it's a spectrum. Okay. Um, doesn't matter what school you go to. It depends on what you want to do. If you want to work at the big New York law firms and make $200,000 right out of law school, and also like work 16 hours a day, if that's what you want to do, then you should go to as good of a school as you can get into. Hopefully, one of the very top schools. If you want to be a lawyer in a small town and have a practice where you are doing a wide variety of kind of activities for people in your community who walk in the door, it does not matter where you go to law school, because they certainly more than Lisa Beth have never heard of the T14 and do not care what law school you went to. Okay. So and then everywhere in between. It especially matters for your first job. Okay. When you are applying, for instance, to go in-house after having practiced, they don't want to know where you went to law school. They want to know what you can do and what value you bring to the table. And so it's really more like looking for a real job,
So
right?
experience does eventually transcend the degree
After, I
name
think
on the
after
degree.
like your first or second job, nobody
Mhm.
really starts caring that much
Okay.
about your law school.
Exactly. Now, is the quality of legal education different as between the different ranks of law school is also an interesting question. Okay, so I am not an expert, but from what I have seen, I think that law schools really offer a fairly consistent educational experience. And part of that is because the American Bar Association requires a great deal of conformity from law schools about what they are offering. And about, for instance, the bar passage percentage rates and those sorts of things, or else they get unaccredited, which is why we have unaccredited law schools. They've either chosen not to try to meet those standards, they're trying to do something different, or they have failed to reach those standards and they get unaccredited. Um, so I would encourage people when they are applying to law school, first take the LSAT and see what you get.
Mhm.
Okay, because if you do not do great on the LSAT, then you are not going to go to the T14, and then you need to decide whether the kind of lawyer jobs that are available to you are exciting to you or not. Maybe not. Okay. And I actually wrote an article about what is a good LSAT score on JD Navigator because I remember well
And
getting my score.
there's a link in our chat
Oh,
to
good.
that.
Yeah, getting my score and saying, okay, so now I have a number. Like, what does that tell me about whether I can be a lawyer and whether I have to pay full price and where I
Yeah.
should go, right? Um, I would also really encourage people to think about, or at least, apply to both schools that are the best schools that they can get into based on their LSAT score, and schools of a tier or two below in the hopes of getting those scholarships. And then you can dig in, look at those schools, think about what that would bring to you, and make an informed decision as between them.
So
Great.
just as an FYI, because I've now looked up the T14. So I went to a non T14 for my JD degree, but then I went to a T14 for my LLM, which is a kind of a 1 year follow on.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I had no idea what it meant. So clearly
Well,
status is not one of my key
you've
triggers.
done something right,
Yeah,
regardless.
which is something I appreciate about you, actually, Lisa Beth, that you are relatively unaware of status. Um, but that actually is a good way to spruce up your resume. Actually, if you go to an undergrad or a JD that is not as highly regarded of school, adding a better school on top can be a nice way to do that.
And I
Now,
know
where does
a lot of people decide to get LLMs to specialize later on if they're really interested in an area. And an LLM or an SJD is kind of that next degree beyond the JD.
Right, because another thing we should say about law school is you don't tend to specialize in law school, right? Like we were telling Daniel, he has to take civil procedure and constitutional law. Okay, even if he wants to get out and just do his same job or get the promotion to the next level, right? So an LLM is one way to demonstrate, is to focus in an intellectual way and to demonstrate mastery in a very specific area of law. For instance, most people who practice tax law at a very high level have an LLM in tax, right? It's
Right.
very complicated, and that's how they both know a great deal and quickly show on their resume that they know a great deal.
And before we move on too much, one of the things that's becoming more prevalent now is LLMs in compliance.
Mm.
LLMs in compliance, courses in compliance. That is something that's been added, and sometimes schools are even doing masters in compliance for people who are not lawyers but want. It's basically the same classes. It's just a master's rather than an LLM because they don't have the JD degree.
Right. So they don't have to take Civ Pro. They get to just
Right.
take compliance classes, right? And
Right.
so that can be um a good path to consider as well if you want to stay in your same area, but you need to add a little bit of credential. Mhm.
Sure. Go
So we
ahead,
talked.
Dan.
So just one quick follow on the LSAT. When is the right? You said take a look at your LSAT scores. When's the right time to? When do you take the LSAT in the year? When considering like how far in advance, based on starting a semester in the autumn.
Yes. Yeah. So let's say you have your eye on starting law school September 2021, which would probably be the next start from now. Um, you would want to take the LSAT probably in February 2021,
Okay.
or even the one before in December 2020, which means that it's time to register
Okay.
for the December 2020 LSAT. This is sort of a long process, right? To get registered for the LSAT, take it, get your
Mhm.
scores, apply to law school. I mean, you said a 3-year process earlier, Elizabeth. It's really more of like a 4.5-year process once we
Wow.
build in taking the LSAT and taking the bar exam and getting your scores, or
Yeah.
and finding out whether you passed the bar exam. And then finally you can work as a lawyer.
So,
It's not as long as med school, but it's a long road.
yeah. Can you take the LSAT more than once?
Yes, and most people do actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
The
they suggest
averaged, is it
2
just
or 3 times, maybe. Yeah, sort of like the SAT, what people are doing with the SAT now. I have a senior in high school, so I'm thinking a lot about undergrad education right now. Sorry for all the yes.
Makes sense. So, so you can take the LSAT more than once, and then do you have choices about which one to hand over, or um, is that
Yes, I think most schools will just look at your highest
okay?
LSAT, whichever one that turned out to be. I think there are a few schools that say that they will take your average.
Okay,
Um, but I think most schools just take your highest one.
That's
there you
nice.
go.
That's
And in
refreshing. That's
addition,
refreshingly. That's refreshingly nice.
it's true. Yeah.
Admissions processes are never. Our admissions processes are rarely all that adaptive.
Yes. Well, and I was going to say there are other parts of the admissions process too, right? Certainly, there are essays and admissions deadlines and fees and so forth that people should be on top of as well, in addition to just taking the LSAT.
And I don't know what the standards are now, but when do you typically have to get those application packets into law schools, and when are they making decisions by now? Do you know?
Mm. I'm not an expert on that, but I think it's like March, April kind of time frame before you start law school in September. So again, that's why I suggested you take the February LSAT at the latest. Sometimes people get into a situation where they'll apply based on, say, a February LSAT, but then take it again in April, hoping to get a better score, and therefore maybe get in at places where they've been waitlisted or get more scholarship offer. So that happens
Nice.
as well. This past year has been severely disrupted by the pandemic.
Okay.
um, LSAT, like the rest of us, um, struggled with what to do in a pandemic, and ended up canceling a couple of planned LSAT sittings, which then messed
Wow.
up law school admissions. But I think now we are in a pattern where they have figured out how to do this remote LSAT test that they call the LSAT Flex. And they are actually offering the LSAT Flex like 6, maybe 8 times a year now. So it's actually more offerings of the LSAT than there used to be. So I think that's going to work pretty well for applicants. And encourage
Nice.
Good.
people to get signed up and take it if they're thinking about law school, because that will give you a lot of information about how your application might be received, right? Because just to go back to that, I mean, law schools will also look at your undergrad GPA, and then the overall totality of your application as well. But the LSAT score is probably the single most important piece.
Are there any similar to are there any trends similar to that in undergraduate education where moves away from standardized assessments are happening? Is that happening? Is that planned or even being discussed in the law school realm?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Yeah, as you say, there are an increasing number of undergrad institutions that are encouraging people to apply without having either an SAT or an ACT score at all. Um, the law schools, there are a few law schools that will accept the GRE in lieu of the LSAT.
Okay.
Um, and that was a movement that was kind of starting pre-pandemic. I have not seen very much about it recently. Uh, I think, okay, this is just me talking. Frankly, law schools have a really vested interest in making sure that they get people who test well,
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to have to leave and, pass the
Pass the
bar.
bar.
To the degree that we have some real reform on the bar exam and how we design the bar exam and what we're testing for, then we might be able to get some reform on, uh, the LSAT testing, how quickly people can think and fill in logic puzzles, but probably not
Gotcha.
until then.
Okay. Yeah, very
Makes
good.
sense. Well, I know we are running up against the end of our time together. This has
Wow.
been actually a ton of fun. So thank you for educating us, for telling us about some of these basics. And I'm sure that, our listeners will enjoy hearing this. We always end our MentorCore sessions with our signature question, which is, what's the best advice that you ever got from a mentor?
It's a great question. And I've actually really enjoyed listening to your earlier sessions and hearing what people have to say. Um, I think I think mine is advice that I got from my dad even as a kid. My dad is a doctor, and we would say, "Oh, it's so many years, medical school and residency and stuff," and he said, "Well, the years are going to pass anyhow." And really, what he meant by that was, if you just stay in a situation that you're not happy with, then you're going to be there in the future. Like, you might as well work for what you want, uh, because life is short. And so I would encourage people to explore, explore making changes. As you can see, I'm a skeptic about whether law school is right for everyone, and I encourage people to try to make an informed decision. But I am definitely a fan of people getting information and um, moving ahead, moving around, trying to figure out where they want to be.
That's a
Great.
great message. And the time is going to pass just like our time passed with you. So we're so happy to have you here. And this session will be available for people on our Vimeo channel. You can check that out. Thank you for joining us today, Jen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Jen. And just as a reminder for everybody, all the materials, all the articles you referenced are available on jdnavigator.com.
Mhm.
Great.
Definitely. And
Yes.
I'm putting new stuff out there all the time. Lots of free information on the website as well as my email list. And then you will see links on there. I have an online course. In 2 hours, you go from someone who's just seen too much Law and Order to actually getting the basics of
Dun
what law school
dun.
is like and the doors that JD would open up for you.
And we have, for our members, we have an infographic that's from JD Navigator in our member community. And I am sure that we'll be highlighting some more of the JD Navigator events and activities as they come along.
Thanks so much, Jen. Thanks, Lisa Beth. Have a great day, everybody.